The night was thick with tension, the usual hum of Harlem's nightlife muffled by the low, eerie buzz that seemed to pulse through the streets like an impending storm. The lights of the city flickered in the distance, but here, in the shadows of 125th Street, things were quieter than they should have been. Bumpy Johnson could feel it in his bones. Something was off. The air hung heavy, like the calm before a hurricane. He stood outside the dilapidated building, a familiar haunt of his mind working quickly. This wasn't just another night in Harlem. No, tonight it was different. His eyes scanned the shadows, and he didn't need anyone to tell him that danger was near. He had made enemies in his time, plenty of them. But tonight's enemy wasn't some street thug. It was something much bigger. In the distance, a sleek black car pulled up, its headlights casting long shadows across the wet pavement. Bumpy's jaw tightened. He knew who was in that car, Malcolm X. It wasn't the first time their paths had crossed, but tonight, something felt like it was about to change. Malcolm had been a rising force in the civil rights movement, his firebrand speeches and revolutionary ideals quickly making waves across the nation. But here, in Harlem, it was the streets that held sway. And Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed king of the neighborhood, was the one who could help or hinder. There were a lot of people who believed in Malcolm's cause, but they also knew the price of doing business in Harlem wasn't just about ideals, it was about survival. Tonight, it seemed, Malcolm X was going to need a little help with that. As the car came to a halt, Malcolm stepped out, his tall, imposing figure cutting through the gloom. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and emerged unscathed. But Bumpy knew better. Everyone had their breaking point. It was just a matter of when and how. "You know why I'm here, right?" Malcolm said as he approached, his voice low but steady. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was an unease beneath them. Bumpy didn't say anything at first, just looked him over, analyzing the man in front of him. "You're here because you got enemies," Bumpy replied, his tone calm, steady, but there was a heaviness in it. "And those enemies know what kind of power you're building. You think they'll let you rise without trying to knock you down?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "They already have," he said, a bitter edge in his words. "But I'm not going down that easily." Bumpy eyed him, the weight of their conversation not lost on him. He could tell Malcolm was determined, but determination alone wasn't enough to survive in a world like theirs. Bumpy had learned that the hard way, and it had taken everything he had to climb to the top. "I can help you," Bumpy said finally, his voice measured. "But there's a price." Malcolm looked at him, skepticism flickering in his eyes. "What's the price?" Bumpy's gaze hardened. "The price is power, and once you take it, there's no turning back. You'll owe me, just like anyone who wants to take this city." Malcolm stood still for a moment, as if weighing his options. But Bumpy could see it in his eyes. The man was already sold. He just needed the right nudge. Harlem in the 1930s and 40s was a battleground. The streets were teeming with life, but they were also ripe with danger. Drug dealers, mobsters, politicians, and every shade of criminal element found their homes here. But at the heart of it all was Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed king of the streets. Bumpy had started from humble beginnings. Born in Charleston, South Carolina, he had moved to New York as a young man, looking for something better than the life he had back home. What he found was Harlem, a place where survival meant playing the game and playing it well. He had risen quickly through the ranks, taking down anyone who dared challenge him. It didn't take long for people to respect him, to fear him. His reputation preceded him, and he had the connections to back it up. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a leader, a protector of the streets, and someone who demanded respect from everyone who walked through Harlem. But Bumpy didn't just survive the streets, he shaped them. He created a world where the rules were clear. You could do business in Harlem, but you had to pay the price. Bumpy ran the drug trade, the gambling rings, and the protection rackets with a cold but calculated hand. He was a force of nature, a man who could make decisions that changed the fate of entire families. When Bumpy spoke, Harlem listened. Yet, despite all his power, Bumpy knew better than most that power wasn't something you could hold on to forever. The world was changing. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and men like Malcolm X were preaching revolution. Harlem was on the brink of something big, and Bumpy had his finger on the pulse. But change was coming, whether he liked it or not. Malcolm X, a man whose words stirred the souls of thousands, had quickly become a figurehead of the movement. His rise mirrored Bumpy's in many ways. They both wanted to bring change, but while Bumpy's change was carved through the streets with force and intimidation, Malcolm's was built on ideology and firebrand speeches. The two had crossed paths before, but only in fleeting moments. They were from different worlds. Bumpy in the shadows, Malcolm in the light. But tonight they both knew their fates were intertwined. The more Bumpy thought about it, the more the situation became clear. There was a storm coming, and Malcolm X was right in the middle of it. If anyone had the ability to stand up to the system, to challenge the established powers that ran New York, it was Malcolm. But there was one thing that Malcolm didn't have, what Bumpy had in abundance: street power. Bumpy's enemies were everywhere. Rivals in the criminal world, corrupt officials who would sell their souls for a little power, and even factions within the black community that didn't trust his methods. But none of them had the kind of power Bumpy had built in Harlem. He had men, influence, and a reputation that made him untouchable. But even with all that, there was something unsettling about the times. The world was changing too fast, and Bumpy knew that to keep his empire, to protect Harlem, he needed someone with a voice that could move mountains. That someone was Malcolm. But there was a catch. Malcolm's growing movement was gaining national attention, and with it, a larger spotlight on his every move. Harlem was about to be thrust into a much bigger arena. That meant that Bumpy's grip on the streets was in danger of slipping. The old ways of doing business, quietly, behind the scenes, were being replaced by something new, something that didn't fit the world Bumpy had built. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words. The streets of Harlem outside buzzed with the usual energy of night, but inside things were different. This wasn't just about money, power, or survival. It was about the future of a community, a future that Bumpy Johnson knew could very well be altered by one man: Malcolm X. The stakes were higher now, and as Bumpy stood facing Malcolm, his mind raced with the implications of what they were about to do. Malcolm had always been a man of ideas. His words moved crowds, inspired movements, and created a wave that was hard to ignore. But Bumpy wasn't sure if ideals alone could hold the streets of Harlem. In the underworld, ideas were just ideas. The real power came from muscle, from loyalty, and from knowing how to navigate the complex web of allies and enemies that existed in the shadows. "I'm not asking you to do this for me," Bumpy said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "I'm asking you to do it for Harlem, for the people who need someone to watch their back while you're out there fighting for them." Malcolm's eyes never left his. "I know what you're asking, Bumpy, and I know the price. But I need to be sure of one thing before I can walk down this path with you." Bumpy raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Malcolm took a breath, steadying himself. "That I don't lose my soul in the process. That I don't become just another piece in your game, another man on your chessboard." Bumpy stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "You won't. Harlem's yours to lead. I'm just making sure the people you're fighting for have the chance to breathe without the boots of the establishment on their necks. This isn't about me, Malcolm. It's about the future we're building, and that future won't come without sacrifice." There it was, the moment of truth. Malcolm X had always prided himself on being true to his beliefs, on staying grounded in his principles no matter the cost. But here, Bumpy was offering him a chance to protect those ideals, to ensure the safety of his community. But in return, Bumpy needed something that Malcolm wasn't sure he was ready to give. As the conversation hung in the air, an unexpected knock on the door shattered the moment's gravity. Bumpy's body tensed, and his hand instinctively moved to his waist. His reputation for keeping calm in the face of danger was well earned, but tonight wasn't a normal night. Something felt different. The door cracked open, revealing one of Bumpy's trusted men. "Boss, we've got company," the man said, his voice urgent. "Schultz's people. They've been sniffing around. They know something's going on." Bumpy's jaw tightened. Dutch Schultz had been a thorn in his side for years. A known gangster with ambitions that stretched far beyond the streets of Harlem, Schultz had been eyeing the neighborhood for months, and now it seemed like he had finally made his move. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "We don't have time for this." Bumpy looked at him and gave a small, grim smile. "The time's always now." In an instant, Bumpy's crew sprang into action, preparing for what was about to unfold. The stakes of this night were no longer just about aligning with Malcolm. It was about protecting everything they had fought for in Harlem. Bumpy's influence stretched far, but even his empire had its limits. Schultz's men knew how to move in the shadows, and with the political pressure mounting, Bumpy knew this wouldn't be a simple confrontation. This would be the test of whether his rule over Harlem could withstand the storm that was coming. "Stay close," Bumpy said, his eyes locking with Malcolm's. "I'm not losing this fight, and I'm not letting them take you down." Malcolm nodded, a determined look in his eyes. The man was already a force of nature, but now he had become part of something bigger. Together, they would face the chaos that was soon to arrive. The fight that followed would be a defining moment for both of them and for Harlem itself. The night was about to become a battleground. The confrontation was swift. Schultz's men had underestimated Bumpy's network, his ability to move swiftly and strike without hesitation. As Bumpy's men closed in, the sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, breaking the quiet tension that had built up. The dark alleys of Harlem became the site of a violent chess match, each move calculated and ruthless. But in the end, it was Bumpy's crew that walked away victorious. Dutch Schultz's men were scattered, their attempts to seize Harlem shattered in a matter of minutes. The power dynamics in the city had shifted, but Bumpy wasn't one to bask in victory for too long. His eyes remained focused on the bigger picture, Malcolm's vision, their combined effort to secure Harlem's future. Malcolm stood beside him, watching the chaos unfold, but he had a different kind of fire in his eyes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building a future that would lift Harlem's people out of the darkness. But Malcolm knew that the price of this fight wasn't one that could be paid easily. The bloodshed tonight was just a small part of the larger war that would follow. As the last of Schultz's men were rounded up, Bumpy turned to Malcolm, his voice steady but serious. "This is your city now," he said. "But don't think it's going to be easy. You've got enemies who will stop at nothing to take you down." Malcolm met his gaze, his expression resolute. "I know the cost, but this fight is bigger than me, and it's bigger than you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. They were no longer just two men trying to survive. They were now part of a movement that would shape the future of Harlem and the entire nation. The night of the battle had passed, but its reverberations echoed throughout Harlem like a thunderclap. The power shift was not only apparent in the bodies left behind on the pavement, but in the changed atmosphere of the streets themselves. Bumpy Johnson had emerged victorious, once again proving that his grip on Harlem was unyielding. But this time, the stakes were higher. Malcolm X, a rising star in the civil rights movement, was now at the center of it all, and Harlem had become the crucible where his vision of change was being forged. Bumpy had known from the start that his alliance with Malcolm would cost him something, but what he hadn't expected was how much it would change him. He had always prided himself on controlling his environment, on bending the streets to his will. But now, standing alongside Malcolm, Bumpy saw a new kind of power. A power built on ideals, on unity, and on the belief that things could be different. Malcolm's presence in Harlem was not just a beacon for those looking for change, but a spark that ignited something deep within the community. Harlem had long been a battleground, but under Bumpy's reign it had become a kingdom. However, now, with Malcolm's influence, the fight was no longer just about survival. It was about creating a legacy, one that would uplift the people rather than just hold them in place. As the weeks passed, the connection between Bumpy and Malcolm grew stronger. They were two men from different worlds, yet their shared vision for Harlem's future bound them together. Bumpy's knowledge of the streets, his ability to navigate the complexities of power and influence, provided a shield for Malcolm's rising movement. In return, Malcolm's ideology provided Bumpy with something more than just control. It gave him purpose. The streets of Harlem were no longer just about dominance. They were about transformation. But the community knew that nothing came without cost. The price of power was steep, and for every victory, there were losses. Bumpy knew better than anyone that the battle was far from over. His enemies, including those in the political machine and in the criminal world, wouldn't stop. They had seen the power Malcolm could inspire, and they would do anything to tear it down. Yet, through it all, Bumpy's legend only grew. As his bond with Malcolm solidified, so too did his status in Harlem. His ability to hold the line, to protect his people, earned him the unwavering loyalty of the streets. Those who had once feared him now revered him. And for those who had tried to challenge him, well, their fates were sealed in the streets where Bumpy ruled. The respect that Bumpy commanded wasn't just from the men who walked alongside him. It was from the people of Harlem itself. They saw him not as a tyrant but as a protector, someone who understood their struggles and was willing to fight for their survival. His actions that night had cemented his place in history, not just as a gangster but as a leader who had ensured Harlem would remain a bastion of resistance. And Malcolm, though still a man of words, was beginning to understand the weight of Bumpy's actions. The battle in Harlem had made it clear. Words alone couldn't change the system. The system needed to be fought with everything you had, and sometimes that meant doing whatever it took to survive, to win. The legacy of that night, that strange alliance between two powerful men, would live on in the hearts of the people who saw their lives change. Harlem had survived its darkest hours, and now with Bumpy and Malcolm leading the way, the future felt like it was within reach. The streets of Harlem, once a battleground of criminal empires, had become a symbol of something greater. It was no longer just a place where survival was the rule. It was a place where change could take root. Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X, two men from different walks of life, had come together to fight for a common cause. But it wasn't just about power. It was about making Harlem a place where the people had a voice, where they could stand up and fight back against those who sought to oppress them. The events of that night in 1962 marked a turning point, not just for Harlem, but for the country. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson was no longer solely defined by his control over the streets, but by his ability to adapt, to protect, and to lead when it mattered most. And as for Malcolm X, his fight had only just begun. But with Bumpy's support, he knew that no matter what the future held, Harlem was a place where change was possible. This story isn't just about one man's rise to power, or even about the alliance between two men. It's about the people of Harlem, the ones who stood behind them, and the legacy they created together. A legacy that would inspire future generations to stand tall, to fight for what was right, and to never back down in the face of adversity. Because sometimes it takes two legends to remind the world what respect really means.